reality. And I'm here sitting with you. I'm not the version who I want to be. I'm not living my dream life. I am, and so many people like me, they must be thinking about some some unrealistic version of themselves that they want to become. But they know their reality. Like, how do they think and create of that future which they can't even see? That seems so far-fetched. How do I convince myself that I'm gonna be that person who's living a dream life? Because I know my reality and nothing seems to be working right now.
Well, you have one of two choices: to disbelieve or to believe. Believe it could work for me. That is a really big moment. That is the moment the person's no longer the philosopher. That's the moment the person's getting out of the bleachers and getting on the field. That's the person who says, I got to prove to myself that this does work. Now, here's the deal. Either you believe or you don't believe. The person who says, I realized that I believed that it worked for everybody else, but I didn't know if it would work for me. I have to prove to myself that it works for me. The majority of those people never missed a day in their meditation, because if they missed a day, they knew that they weren't believing that they were the creator of their life. Their standard was super high. They didn't go 50% in, 60% in, I'll check to see if it worked. It was no longer about, listen closely, it was no longer about results in their life. It was 100% about effort. It was all effort. They came up against their shadow self. They came up against their disbelief. They came up against their pain. They came up against their fear. They came up against not feeling well, feeling sick. They came up against their self-doubt. They came up with the fact that they didn't have enough time, but guess what? They did their meditation anyway, and they overcame their fear. They overcame their self-doubt. They overcame their disbelief. They overcame, their pain. They overcame their body. They started surrendering to love instead of fear, and their belief in themselves was earned. It was the overcoming, showing up even when they doubted, even when they disbelieved. They showed up anyway, and I was just looking at a testimony the other day. The guy had a 9.5 inch tumor on his kidneys. 9.5 inches. I said to him, were there days where you didn't want to do your meditation? He said, oh yeah, I didn't feel well a lot of those days. I said, you do it anyway? He said, yep, never missed a day. I said, were there days where you doubted? He said, oh yeah, my family thought I was crazy. Did you do them anyway? Yeah, I overcame my doubt that day. And there's some people, I say to them, why were you doing your meditations 3 times a day? 3 times a day. They'll say, the chemo wasn't working, the radiation wasn't working, the surgeries didn't work, the drug trial didn't work, the vegan, ketogenic, the intermittent fasting, none of the diets worked. The only thing I was left with was my belief in myself, right? The reason I did my meditations 3 times a day is because I started to disbelieve. I had one of 2 options: die or show up for myself. And I would not get up from that meditation until I believed in my future again. And the only way, as I said, you can believe in that future is to transform those limited emotions into elevated emotions. The person has to find something in them where they could feel the emotion of gratitude and fall in love with the idea of that they could heal. And it's that thought and that feeling, that image and that emotion, that stimulus and response that can condition their body into the emotion and the mind of their future. And they get up and they believe more in their future than when they started. Some people, they finish their meditation and they believe less in their future at the end of their meditation because they never overcame themselves. And this is where the rubber meets the road, because they're uncompromising, because nothing else has worked, right? So to me, that's greatness. I'd rather sit with that person and talk to that person than any famous person in the world. They know the truth. They stand on the stage. They're standing in front of an audience. I'm looking at the audience. They're telling their story. And everybody's leaning in. Everybody's leaning in because there's the example of truth. There's a 4-minute mile. There's someone who broke through a certain level of consciousness or unconsciousness, and they don't look vegan, they don't look particularly young, they're not dressed very well, they're not fit, they just look like a person you would pass in the grocery store. But they changed their health in some way, and it's everybody in the audience is looking at them. And I know that some people in the audience are going to identify with that person. They're going to say, she doesn't look particularly different than me. I have the same diagnosis. If she could do it, I can do it. And that's the power of community, because then once it's in the collective consciousness and you witness it, it's no longer just theoretical. There's truth standing there. There's truth on the stage. They have the scans, they have the blood tests, the tumors are gone, everything's gone. It becomes very infectious. And then all of a sudden we had 5 people with Raynaud's syndrome at one event. Where you lose blood flow into your extremities. 5, because one person stood on the stage and told their story. 4 other people by the end of that event stood on the stage, no more Raynaud's. We had 5 people that were in wheelchairs with all kinds of reasons, spinal cord injuries, myasthenia gravis, rheumatoid arthritis, lupus, ALS, head traumas. One person stood out of the wheelchair. 4 other people stood out. We had 2 people that were blind. I mean, imagine that. That was a crazy one. Couldn't see. At the end of the event, by the middle of the event, 1 person stood on the stage. By the end of the event, it was 2 people. It's insane. That's the power. That's the power that lives in every human being when you start seeing possibility like that. Because people only do the best with what they think is available. If you don't know what's available, you'll make the same choice. Once you know it's possible, you're not nobody's so special to be excluded when you're in a community like that. And the person's in their 70s, or they're in their later years, and doctors are telling them you're too old, or you're just going to learn to live with that. Those people are like, no, I'm not going to live with this. No, this is not how it's going to end for me. Like, that's what it takes, right? So, yeah, there's too much to say, like, oh, well, I just can't muster it up in me. Well, then, what do you want? What do you want? If you really want it, you'll find a way, right?